Today you join me on the banks of the River Wandle in South London. Now the Wandle is a lovely and intimate chalk stream, and with winter fully set in, many of the lakes are frozen over and rivers are flooded, but the Wandle is still really good for a bite. I did actually pop over to this swim last week, and on a short session I managed to lose a nice chub that seemed to live amongst the resident carp here, so I'm now hoping I can win round 2 on today's session. And as you can see, these are just a couple of the carp that seem to live along this stretch of the river. I spend a lot of my time just watching fish. It's so fascinating, trying to understand their habits and their patterns, how they feed and when they feed. And as you can see, some of the snags and the litter in this part of the river is really bad. Now above the surface, this is one of my favourite swims. It may not be hard to see why. There's a really nice fast glide across the middle. There's a deep pool underneath, a lot deeper than it looks. You've got an eddy at the front and the back. It seems to just have everything, this swim. But as I've said, there are some really horrible snags. You've got the usual moped, shopping trolley, traffic cones, you name it, it's probably in here. The river itself is not for the faint-hearted. There are people everywhere, there are constant sirens, there's construction work that seems to be happening non-stop. If it's a peaceful day by the river that you're looking for, then this isn't it. The rewards really are there to be had if you do your homework. In terms of kit, I always travel light. For this session, I've just got a single rod, a net, an unhooking mat, a shoulder bag, and a bait pouch. That is literally it, and of course my camera. The rod itself, I'm using a Darren Valley 11-foot specialist rod, a small Shimano 2500 reel loaded with 6-pound Gardner line, and a Drennan stick float. My shoulder bag contains any of the extra essentials, additional floats, feeders, disgorgers, scales, basically anything that you don't want to be found without. My approach to the fishing was going to be trotting a stick float. I found this to be the best way of getting the fish out of this swim. They do swim around a lot. It's easy to adjust the depth to find the fish. I spent the first half an hour or so just trickling maggots in, just getting their interest up, and I was able to watch some of the carp from above feeding just to learn their habits and the routes that they were taking. Bait of choice was going to be maggots. I did put a little bit of ground bait in through the day as well, but there isn't a fish that swims that doesn't eat maggots, and I find they really come into their own this time of year. You can see from how these carp are feeding how preoccupied they are on the bait that is going down, that even as I move the camera around tracking them and following them, they just really aren't bothered. I continued to trickle the bait in. It's important if there are fish in your swim and you know they're feeding, to make sure there's always some bait for them to go for. You want to keep them grubbing around the whole time. What I couldn't actually see from where I was above the surface were how many minnows there are, and as they started to get more confident, I began to catch a few of those, and they did begin to plague me after a while. I continue to work my way through the minnows and just adjust the depth slightly. It's important to move the depth up and down slightly, even if it's just a couple of inches, as the fish come up and down in the water columns. But also what I hadn't seen was at this point the chub had moved in and pushed the minnows out, and I knew that if I'd continued to feed, that eventually any good fish in the area would come onto these maggots. I kept that feeding pattern up, and not long after the float signalled a slightly better take, and as I lifted into it, the rod hooked over. I wasn't ready for it because I hadn't seen it, but it gave a really good account of itself. You can see here as the chub tries to shake the hook that the carp scatter. I didn't want to mess around with it, knowing how many snags and obstacles there were under the surface, and within about 30 seconds she'd come in. She was ready to net. The second time round she was all mine. On the scales she went bang on £7, which is a new PB for me. And having come from a river that holds a special place for me, having grown up as a kid fishing it, this was a really memorable day. I left the river a content angler for a change. If there's a small water in your area, don't ignore it, as it may hold some real gems.